They sold the bruised young woman last. After the cattle, a rancher raised his hand. The auctioneer's bell was still ringing when I walked into that yard. Hadn't planned to go. I'd driven the buckboard into Harlow Creek to pick up a spool of fencing wire and a sack of oats, maybe stop at the feed store long enough to argue with Cal Briggs about the price of hay the way we'd been arguing about the price of hay for 11 years. That was the whole of my errand. That was the whole of my Tuesday. But the yard behind the stock bin, Munro's yard, they called it, though Munro had been dead 6 winters and his son Arlo ran it now. The yard was thick with men and noise when I passed, and I pulled the horses up out of habit more than anything. You hear a crowd in a town like Harlow Creek, you stop. Could be trouble, could be news, could be nothing at all. It was a dispersal auction. That's what the hand-painted sign nailed to the post said. Dispersal. I'd seen a few in my years. A man dies or goes broke or runs off, and what he owned gets sold off in pieces on a Tuesday morning to whoever shows up with coin. The pieces don't care whose hands they pass into. That's the nature of a dispersal. I tied the horses and stood at the back of the crowd. Didn't push through. I'm not a man who pushes through crowds. I'm built wide enough that I don't need to. I can see over most heads without trying, but it's not my nature to jostle. I stood and I watched. They'd already moved through the tools and the furniture. A wardrobe with a cracked mirror, a set of harness that had seen better days, an iron stove, the usual debris of a life. Men were bidding with their hands barely moving, the way men do when they want something but don't want to seem like they want it. The cattle came next. 8 head of shorthorn, decent animals, a little drawn from the look of them, but nothing a good pasture wouldn't fix. I didn't bid. I had more cattle than I needed already and less patience than I used to for adding to the head count. I watched the prices and thought about the wire I had to pick up. Then the yard went a little quiet. Not silent. There was still shuffling and coughing and the sound of boots on hard-packed ground. But the particular noise of men bidding, that back-and-forth bark of it, went away. And I looked up from the ground where I'd been watching an ant drag something twice its size toward a crack in the fence post, and I saw what had come up for sale. She was standing at the edge of the auctioneer's platform, not on it, beside it, with her arms folded across her front and her eyes on the ground somewhere past the first row of men. Young. Couldn't have been more than 22, 23. Brown hair pinned back but coming loose on one side. A dress that had been decent once and wasn't anymore. And her face. I want to say she was pretty. She was. But that's not what I saw first, and it wasn't what kept my eyes where they were. What I saw first was her jaw, the set of it, and the way her shoulders were pulled in like she'd been expecting a blow for so long they'd just stayed that way. And then I saw what was wrong with her face. The left side of it was yellowed and fading at the edges, the particular color a bad bruise turns about a week after it lands. High up on the cheekbone under the eye. Not fresh, but not old. Arlo Munro was talking. I could hear him from where I stood, that oiled wheel voice of his, explaining the terms and the particulars. The woman, her name was Nora Voss, he said, recently widowed, had come into Harlow Creek owing a debt that the dispersal of her husband's estate had not satisfied. The debt was to a man named Cutter who wasn't present but had sent an agent, a narrow-faced fellow in a brown coat standing near the platform with a ledger. There had been an arrangement. Indenture was the word Arlo used. Indenture. It's an old word and a cold one. The terms were read out. Whoever paid the remaining debt, $114, would hold Nora Voss's labor contract for a period of 12 months. She'd work as domestic labor was the phrase. Cook or clean or whatever else the buyer required. I stood there and listened to this. The ant was still working at whatever it was dragging. The crowd wasn't loud, but they weren't silent either. There were men laughing low, the way men laugh when they think they're about to get something. The bidding opened at $60. 3 men raised their hands. I knew 2 of them. One was a brothel owner from the next town over, A man named Das, who had a way of looking at things he intended to acquire that made your skin tighten. One was a rancher named Pollard who had a reputation I won't bother describing, except to say his last two hired women had both left the territory inside of 6 months. The third I didn't know. Das bid 70, Pollard went to 80, the third man dropped out. Das came back at 85, Pollard at 90. The narrow-faced agent with the ledger was watching all of this with the patience of a man doing arithmetic. And the woman, Nora Voss, stood there with her arms folded, and her eyes on the ground and her jaw set, and she didn't look up once. Not once. I have thought about what happened next more times than I can count, tried to find the exact thought I had if I had one at all. I was 54 years old. I had a ranch 12 miles northeast of Harlow Creek that I'd built from nothing over 20-some years. I had cattle and horses and a bunkhouse with 2 hired men and a cook who was half-deaf and made the best cornbread in the county. I had no wife. I had no children living. I had a life that was orderly and solitary and not what I'd imagined when I was young, but it was mine, and it worked, and I wasn't the sort of man who made large, unplanned decisions on a Tuesday in a stockyard. And yet, I raised my hand at $115. Not because I felt sorry for her. I want to be honest about that. Pity is a small thing, and what moved in me when I looked at her was not small. It was something older and harder than pity. It was something that lives way down in a man, under all the years of keeping his head down and minding his own ground, something that says, "No, not this, not here, not while I'm standing here watching." The yard went quiet in a different way. Das turned around and looked at me. Pollard did too. A few other men. I'm not an unknown face in Harlow Creek. I've been buying feed and wire and arguing about hay prices in this town for better than 2 decades. They know me. Harlan Briggs, the Cornerstone Ranch, 12 miles northeast. That's who I am in this town. Pollard bid 120. I went to 135. There was a pause. Das said something to the man beside him. Pollard looked at me for a long moment. The kind of look men give you when they're deciding how much something means to them against how much it means to you, and then he lowered his hand and looked away. Sold. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that too. I felt the way you feel when you've done something you can't take back and you're not entirely sure you understood it while you were doing it. My heart was going at a different rate than usual. I stood where I was while Arlo Munro's man came through the crowd to collect my payment and work out the particulars. When I got to the platform, Nora Voss looked up. The first time she looked at me. Her eyes were gray. I don't know why that's what I remember. It wasn't what mattered, but they were gray and they were very steady, and they were not asking me for anything. There was no gratitude in them. Not yet. Not right then. What was in them was a kind of watchful measuring, the look of a person who has learned that one bad situation has a way of becoming another bad situation, and she was trying to determine what kind of situation this was. I said, "My name is Harlan Briggs. I have a ranch northeast of here. You'd have your own room, your own lock, your own key. I need a cook and I need someone to keep the house in order. That's all I need." She looked at me for a moment longer. She said, "You have a cook already." I said, "He's half-deaf and he burns the beans." Something moved in her face. Not a smile, something smaller than that. She said, "I'll need to know where the key is kept at all times." I said, "I'll put it in your hand the moment we're off this wagon." She gave a small nod, and that was that. The drive back to the ranch took the better part of 2 hours. She sat beside me on the buckboard with her hands folded in her lap and the bundle she owned, not much, wrapped in an old flour sack between her feet. We didn't talk much. I pointed out landmarks as we passed them, the way you talk to somebody arriving to new country, and she listened and looked where I pointed and sometimes asked a short question. How deep was the creek in spring? Whether the hills to the northwest had a name? Whether the grass the horses moved through was what grew all the way to the property line, or if it changed. Practical questions. I gave her practical answers. Once, somewhere around the 6-mile marker, she said, "Why did you raise your hand?" It wasn't quite a question, more like a thing she was thinking out loud. I kept my eyes on the road. I said, "Because nobody else was going to." She didn't say anything to that. After a while she said, "Das had already bid." I said, "I know who Das is." Another silence. Then she said very quiet, "So do I." I didn't say anything to that either. We let the sound of the wheels and the horses fill it, and the wind off the hills, and the creek somewhere out of sight to the east. Tom Felder was my cook. He'd been with me 9 years, a bandy-legged man from somewhere in the Missouri Hill Country who could read your lips better than most men could hear, and who had opinions about beef that bordered on religious conviction. He looked at Nora Voss when we pulled into the yard, and then he looked at me, and I could see the question forming. I said, "This is Nora. She'll be helping with the house and the cooking. You two can work out between you how the kitchen runs." Tom looked at her again. He had a way of sizing up a person that wasn't rude exactly, but wasn't soft either. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and something passed between them. Some mutual acknowledgement of people who have been knocked around by the world and know how to read the signs on someone else. And he gave a small nod and said, "You know how to make biscuits that don't break your teeth?" She said, "I do." He said, "Then we'll get along fine." I showed her the room. It was at the back of the house, off the kitchen, a small room with a window that looked east and a good iron bed and a chest of drawers that had been my wife's. I gave her the key, put it directly in her hand the way I'd said I would. She looked at it for a moment and then put it in the pocket of her dress. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Briggs." I said, "Harlan." She didn't use it that day, but she would. The first week she moved through the house like she was still figuring out what it was. Quiet, careful, always knowing where the door was. I didn't crowd her. I kept to the patterns of the ranch, up before light, out with the horses, back mid-morning for a bite, out again, in at dark, and I let the house be hers to settle into. Tom told me on the 3rd day that she could cook. Said it the way he said most things, flat and certain. "She can cook," he said. "She'll be fine." I said, "I know." He gave me a look. Tom had a way of giving looks that said whole paragraphs without his face having to do much. This one said something about the bruise that was still fading on her face and about $135 and about what kind of man I was. I didn't address it. We moved on. My 2 hired men, Gus, who was 50 and reliable, and a younger man called Webb, who was 27 and learning, treated her with the careful distance of men who understand without being told how a situation should be handled. Gus in particular. He had daughters somewhere back east, and he had a quality around women in difficulty that was decent without making anything of itself. She cooked. She kept the house. She mended things without being asked. I came in one evening to find my torn work shirt folded clean on the chair, the tear stitched up so neatly you had to look twice to find where it had been. She organized the kitchen in a way Tom considered revolutionary, and which he pretended to object to and then quietly adopted. And she learned the ranch. That's the thing I remember. A lot of people come to new country and they look at the surface of it, the pretty parts. Nora Voss looked at how things worked. She asked me about the north pasture fence that needed repair and what wood I intended to use, and whether I'd thought about the angle of the runoff from the hill above it. She asked about the horses, which ones were gentle, which needed handling, what their histories were. She learned the pattern of the water supply, the way the creek behaved in different seasons, which parts of the range dried up first. I started talking to her more in the evenings, not deliberately. It just happened, the way things do when you're used to a quiet house and something changes in it. I'd be at the table with the account books after supper, and she'd be mending by the lamp, and one of us would say something and it would unspool from there. Talk about the ranch mostly. Talk about what I was planning for the spring, whether the south herd needed culling, whether it was worth trying to put in a root cellar. Practical talk. But not only that. One night she asked me about the photograph on the mantel, a woman and a child. I said my wife, her name was Alice, the boy was Daniel. She waited. I said fever, 8 years ago, Daniel was 4. She was quiet for a long moment, then she said, I'm sorry. I said, so was I for a long time. She said, and now? I thought about it, I said, now it's just what's true. She nodded, like she understood exactly what that meant. Like she'd arrived at similar terms with her own true things. There's a particular quality to time on a ranch in late autumn. The days shorten and the air gets a bite and the work changes. It's all about what you're putting in and closing down and getting ready for what's coming. The cattle move closer in. The horses grow their winter hair. The ground has a smell in the morning, just after the first hard frost, that's different from every other smell of every other season. Cold and particular and very clean. I watched her come alive in it. I don't know a better word. She'd arrived in September like something shut down, like a house with the shutters closed, and by October the shutters were starting to open. Small things. She laughed once in the kitchen with Tom, a real laugh, not a polite one, about something the cat had done with a spool of thread, and I heard it from the porch and stood there for a moment like a man trying to remember the name of something. By November she was out in the yard in the mornings before I was, sometimes, looking at the frost patterns on the fence posts. I'd come out and she'd already have the coffee on, and she'd be leaning on the rail with a cup in her hand, looking east the way she'd been looking east since the first day, when I told her that window looked east. I asked her once what she was looking at. She said, the light changing. The way it comes up different every morning and then it's gone by the time you can name what it was. I said, you're a lot of things for a woman working off a debt. She looked at me sideways. She said, what does that mean exactly? I said, it means you think more than most people I've known. She said, that's not a particularly high bar, ranching country. And she smiled. Not the small barely there thing I'd seen in flashes. A real smile. And I felt something shift in me the way ground shifts after a long dry, so gradual you don't know it's moving until the whole surface is different from what it was. The trouble came in December. I had known it might. The narrow-faced man with the ledger, his name was Garvey, and he worked for Cutter the way rust works for water, by slow and patient destruction, had taken down my name and my ranch at the auction, and I had no particular reason to believe that was the last I'd see of him. He came on a Wednesday, Garvey did, with 2 other men. I was in the upper pasture with Webb when Tom came out to find me, moving as fast as his legs would carry him, which at that point in his life was not very fast, but the urgency was clear enough. I came back to the house. Garvey was standing in my yard with his ledger under his arm and his coat buttoned up against the cold and a look on his face like he'd arrived somewhere he had rights. The 2 men with him were bigger than him and quieter, and they were the sort of quiet that comes from being paid to make problems go away. Nora was standing on the porch, standing straight, her arms at her sides. Garvey said, Mr. Briggs, a word about your arrangement with the woman. I said, my yard, you can say what you've got to say from there. He said that there were some irregularities in the auction documentation. He said that Cutter had reviewed the terms, and there was a question of whether the debt had in fact been fully discharged. He said that there may be a remainder owed, and he produced from the ledger a figure, another $40, that he said had come to light upon review. I looked at him. I said, the auctioneer's papers were signed and witnessed. He agreed that was so. He said the irregularity was in the original debt instrument, not the auction itself. He said it was a legal matter, and he said it the way you say something when you don't mean legal, when you mean something else. I said, then your employer can file with the county clerk and wait for the circuit judge. Garvey looked at me with those pale eyes and said he thought we could perhaps resolve this more simply. He said Cutter was willing to accept the $40 or, as an alternative, the return of the woman in satisfaction of the debt. He said it just like that, return of the woman. I felt something in my chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite something else. It was cold, is what it was, very clear and very cold. I said, "Get off my land." He said, "Mr. Briggs." I said, "I won't say it again." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the two men with him. Then he looked back at me. There's a particular calculation that happens in moments like that, men with uncertain intentions reading a man they hadn't fully expected. I wasn't a young man. I was 54 and gray at the temples, and I wasn't wearing iron. But I've been on this land for 23 years, and I've dealt with drought and flood and cattle theft, and one instance of a man who tried to burn my south barn. And I have learned over those years how to stand in my own yard in a way that communicates certain things without being performed about it. He said, "You'll be hearing from us." I said, "I expect so." They left. I stood in the yard until the sound of their horses was gone. Then I went up to the porch. Nora was still standing there, and the expression on her face was not fear. Exactly. She'd gotten past simple fear, I thought, some time before she ever arrived in my yard, but something concentrated and hard that I recognized as the look of a person calculating what comes next. She said, "He'll be back." I said, "Probably." She said, "What will you do?" I said, "I'll go see the county clerk tomorrow morning and get the documentation put straight. Then I'll pay a visit to the circuit judge's man in Coldwater, because Cutter's been playing this game with other people's debts in this county for 3 years, and I'm not the only man in Harlow Creek who'd like to see it end." She looked at me. I said, "And if they come back before then, my answer will be the same." She said, "Harlan, what did you buy at that auction?" It was the first time she'd used my name. I looked at her. I thought about the answer to that question, really thought about it, the way you think about something when a direct question has a direct path to what's true. I said, "I bought the right to make sure you weren't sold to a worse man." She held my eyes for a moment. Then she looked away, out at the yard, and I could see her jaw working the way it did when she was thinking something through. She said, "That's the most and the least of it, isn't it?" I didn't answer. She already knew I wouldn't. I went to the county clerk the next morning. His name was a man called Prentice, who was meticulous to a fault and who had no patience for what he called irregularity, which was his word for anything that smelled like fraud. I laid out the auction papers and the original debt instrument that Garvey had been referring to, and Prentice looked at it for a long time over his spectacles. He said, "This alteration here," he pointed to a line, "was made after signing. The ink is different. See the color." I saw the color. He said, "Mr. Cutter's man has been busy." I said, "I'd like this noted in the county record." Prentice looked at me with a particular kind of satisfaction that clerks get when paperwork reveals what it should reveal. He said, "It'll be noted." I went to Coldwater the following week. The circuit judge's man was a lawyer named Hanks who had reason to know Cutter's name from prior complaints, and who listened to what I had to say with the careful attention of a man building something. I wasn't the only complaint. There were 2 others he was already working with. He said he'd have papers ready for the next circuit. On the way back, I stopped at Cal Briggs' feed store. No relation. We'd been confusing people for years, and Cal said, "Heard you had visitors out your way." I said, "Word gets around." He said, "Garvey came in here the day after, asking questions about your finances, whether you were liquid, that kind of thing." I said, "What you tell him?" Cal said, "I told him you were the most solid man in this valley, and that if he had a dispute with you, he'd be better served by the county clerk than by whatever he was planning." I looked at Cal. I said, "I appreciate that." He said, in the way men say things they mean but won't belabor, "You did right at that auction, Harlan. People noticed." I drove home. She was waiting when I got back. Not standing watch. She wasn't a woman who stood waiting, but she was in the kitchen and she knew the sound of my rig on the road, and she came to the door when I pulled in. I told her what Prentice had found. I told her what Hanks had said. I told her that the debt was documented fraud and that the next circuit would likely see Cutter in front of the judge on 2 other complaints at minimum. She stood very still and listened to all of it. When I was done, she said, "So it's settled." I said, "Close to it, close enough." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You went to the county clerk for me." I said, "I went for the record. The record needed to be right." She said, "Harlan." I said, "Yes." She said, "You paid $135 and a day's work with the county clerk and a ride to Coldwater and back." I said, "The wire I came into town for cost $4. I'd already gone over budget." She almost smiled. "Almost," she said. "Are you always like this?" I said, "Like what?" She said, "Like someone who does a large thing and then talks around the edges of it." I thought about that. I said, "I suppose I am." She said, "I grew up with a man like that, my father. He wasn't a man who made speeches." I said, "Were they like this, the things he did?" She said, "Once or twice." We were quiet together for a moment. The kitchen was warm. Tom had left the lamp burning low on the table, and it made the room that particular amber color that lamps make in cold weather when the dark is sitting right outside the glass. She said, "I don't know what to do with this." I said, "You don't have to do anything with it." She said, "That's not." She stopped, looked at her hands on the table. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. She said, "I had a husband for 3 years. He was not a bad man to begin with. He became a bad man. I don't know if that's worse or better than starting as one. I'm 23 years old and I was sold in a yard like an animal, and I still don't entirely know what I'm doing here." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm not asking you for anything." I said, "I know you're not." She said, "I just need you to understand that I'm not." She stopped again, looked up at me, and what I saw in her face then was not the measuring, watchful thing I'd seen on the day I bought her out of that yard. It was something more open than that, more uncertain, more true. I said, "You're not what?" She said, "I'm not trying to be difficult." I said, "Nora, you are the least difficult thing in my life, and that's saying a great deal because my life is mostly fence posts and the price of hay." She looked at me and she laughed. The real one I'd heard from the kitchen, warm and sudden, and I laughed too, which surprised me, because it had been a while since I'd laughed at anything all the way through. December finished. January came in hard, the way it does up in that country, a wind that came off the high ground and found every gap in every board and rattled the stovepipe at 3 in the morning until you thought the roof was coming off. We worked through it the way you work through a January on a ranch. Close in, constant, all the small things that keep the large things alive. Horses blanketed and watered through ice. Cattle moved to the south windbreak. The roof of the tool shed had a leak that I'd been putting off since October and couldn't put off any longer. She worked alongside. Not the housework only, she was out in it. She knew the horses by then, knew which ones to approach from which side and which ones wanted to be spoken to first. Gus found that out on a January morning when he saw her walk straight up to the roan gelding that had been giving him trouble all week and put her hand on the animal's neck and just stand there, not asking it for anything, and the horse's ears went loose and its weight settled back on its haunches. Gus looked at me over the fence rail. He said, "Where did she come from?" I said, "Harlow Creek." He said, "Before that?" I said, "I don't know all of it." He said, "She's something." I didn't disagree. There was an evening in January that I think about sometimes, a Sunday. Tom had gone to bed early, his knees gave him trouble in the cold, and Gus and Webb were in the bunkhouse, and the house was quiet with just the 2 of us and the stove and the wind outside. I was at the table with the account books, the same as always, and she was doing something with the lamp on the other side, mending or reading. I don't remember which, and I looked up from the numbers at some point and she was already looking at me. Not as a look meant to be caught, just as the kind of looking you do when you're thinking about something you haven't said. I said, "What?" She said, "Nothing, I was just thinking." I said, "About what?" She said, "About whether there is such a thing as a person who does the right thing without wanting anything from it. Whether that's real or whether it's just a story people tell." I said, "I don't think I'm the subject of a story." She said, "No, that's what I mean." I didn't know quite what to do with that, so I went back to the account books. But I was aware, the way you become aware of something that's been in a room for a while, and you've finally stopped being able to ignore it, of the particular quality of that lamp on the other side of the table, and the sound of her breathing, and the fact that this house felt different from how it had felt for 8 years. February, the worst of it. A blizzard came in on a Thursday and stayed for 3 days. The kind of storm that lays down a foot of snow and then lays down another foot on top of it, and the wind turns it sideways so you can't see your hand at arm's length. We'd prepared. I'd been ranching long enough to read a February sky, but you can prepare and still have the world come in harder than you planned for. On the second night of it, about 2 in the morning, I heard something wrong in the horse barn. Not the usual shifting of animals in the cold, a sound like panic. I was up and dressed and out before I was fully awake. The bay mare, the one I'd had longest, 15 years, her name was Lucy, and I won't apologize for naming a horse, had gotten into trouble with the cold. Her leg was twisted in the stall gate, and she was down at an angle that was going to break something if it didn't get solved quickly. It was dark and it was loud with the wind, and she was frightened and moving wrong, and I needed a second set of hands. Nora was there before I could get back to the house to call for anyone. She must have heard it too. She was in her coat and her boots, and she had a lamp, and she came into the barn and took in the situation in about 3 seconds flat. She went straight to the mare's head, didn't hesitate, didn't look at me for direction, put her hands on Lucy's jaw and her face close and talked to her. I couldn't hear what she said over the wind and the mare's noise, and I watched the animal stop trying to fight the gate. It took us 20 minutes to get the leg free. Not clean work, cold hands and bad footing and the mare still shaking, but we did it. When it was done, I stood there with my shoulder against the barn wall and my hands on my knees, and I was breathing harder than I'd have liked to admit. Nora was still at Lucy's head, still talking low, her hand moving in circles on the animal's neck. She looked over at me. She said, "You all right?" I said, "Fine." She said, "You're not. You went whiter than the snow out there at the end." I said, "I'm fine." She looked at me a moment longer, that steady gray look that had settled me the first day and still had the same quality to it, and she said, "Sit down." I said, "I don't need to sit down." She said, "Harlan, sit down." I sat down. On a hay bale with the cold coming through my coat and the lamp throwing shadows on the boards. She finished settling the mare, and then she came and sat beside me. Not across from me. Beside me. Close enough that I could feel the warmth of her arm against mine through 2 layers of winter coat. She said, "When did you last have a person sit with you through something?" I thought about it. I said, "Can't remember." She said, "That's what I thought." We sat there for a while. The wind was doing what it does in a February blizzard, which is to say everything, and the barn creaked around us, and Lucy stood steady now, and the lamp put out its small circle of yellow, and Nora Voss sat beside me in the dark and the cold of my horse barn, and I felt something that I had been standing at the edge of for months take 1 step closer. I said, "Why are you still here?" She said, "The contract's not up." I said, "I discharged the contract in January. Prentice confirmed the debt was void. You've been here as a—" I stopped, said, "You've been here as whatever you want to call it." She was quiet. I said, "I didn't tell you because I didn't know how to say it without it sounding like something it wasn't. She said, "What was it?" I said, "I didn't want you to leave." She kept looking straight ahead, at Lucy, at the dark of the barn, at whatever she was looking at, a long moment. Then she said, "I know, I knew in November." I said, "And?" She said, "And I'm still here." She turned her head and looked at me. The lamp was close enough to show the particular gray of her eyes, the particular set of her face, not the closed down, folded in set of the woman at the auction, but something open and clear and decided, like a woman who has thought something through completely and arrived at where she intended to go. She said, "I'm not here because I owe you something, Harlan. I'm done owing." I said, "I know that." She said, "I'm here because this is a good place, and you're a—" She stopped, worked something in her jaw, then she said, "You're a man I want to be near. That's the plain truth of it." I looked at her. I'm not a man who cries. Haven't been, not since Alice, not since the fever took them. But I felt something move through me at those words that was about as close to it as I'd come in 8 years. Something that had been shut down and cold and orderly cracked open a little in that barn in the middle of a February blizzard, and what came out of it was warm. I put my hand over hers where it rested on her knee. Just that. She turned her hand over under mine and held it, and we sat there like that while the storm did what storms do and Lucy shifted her weight and the lamp burned. Spring came the way spring comes after a hard winter, not gradually, not kindly, but in a rush. 1 week the ground was still iron, and the next week it wasn't, and the air changed and the horses changed, and the whole of the ranch lifted itself up from the crouch it had been in. I had work to do and I did it. The north fence, the root cellar I'd been planning, the south herd needed to be moved and counted, and a few decisions made about culling. The ordinary business of a ranch coming back to life. But the ordinary business of the ranch had changed. I don't mean in dramatic ways, in the way of daily things. She was out in the morning when I came out, the same as before, but now she'd sometimes fall in beside me when I was checking the fence line, and we'd walk it together without it needing to be explained. She took over the account books from me in March, not because I asked her to, but because I'd made an error in the winter tallies that she caught, and when she looked at the rest of them she saw 3 others, and she turned out to have a head for numbers that made me wonder what she'd been doing being anyone's property. Tom, who had been the center of the kitchen for 9 years and was not given to making room, had made room. He and Nora had developed a partnership in that kitchen that operated on a combination of her organization and his technique, and a great deal of commentary that I could hear from the porch. And that was clearly mutual and clearly affectionate in the way that people are affectionate when they'd rather die than admit it. Gus had appointed himself a kind of unofficial guardian. Not that she needed one, but Gus was that kind of man. He found the things worth protecting and stood near them without making a fuss. Webb had developed an awkward admiration that he expressed mostly by doing extra work on whatever project was nearest to where she was working, which was obvious to everyone including Nora, who was kind about it in the way of a woman who has learned to be kind about things like that without encouraging them. My hired men, my cook, my ranch. Mine was the word I was using in my head by then, and I understood what that meant about what else I was thinking. Cutter's case went to the circuit judge in April. Hanks had built it carefully. There were 3 complainants and the altered debt instrument and 2 prior cases that had been dismissed for insufficient evidence but which told a pattern. The judge found for the complainants. Cutter was ordered to pay restitution, and his debt-broking operation was enjoined from the county. Garvey left the territory within the week. That was the last I heard of either of them. When I told Nora, she was standing at the kitchen window looking out at the yard. She listened to the whole of it, and when I was done she said, "Good." Just that, one word. The word of a woman who is done having to think about a thing. Then she said, "Tom wants to try putting in tomatoes this year. What do you think of a kitchen garden on the south side of the house?" I said, "I think it's a fine idea." She turned and looked at me. She had flour on her hand, and her hair was coming loose the same way it had been coming loose at the auction, and she looked nothing like the woman I'd first seen in that yard and entirely like her. She said, "Harlan, I want to ask you something." I said, "All right." She said, "When you came to that auction in September, when you raised your hand, what did you think was going to happen?" I thought about it. I said, "Honestly, I didn't think, I just did it." She said, "And now, do you know what's happening now?" I said, "I have a pretty good idea." She said, "Tell me." I said, "I'm in love with you, have been since around October, maybe earlier. The love showed up before I was paying attention." She looked at me for a moment. Her expression was not surprised. She'd known. But there was something in it that was quiet and very whole, the expression of a person hearing out loud something they'd already said to themselves in the dark. She came around the table. She put her hand flat on my chest, right there, above my heart, on the worn flannel of my shirt, and she looked at my face the way she looked at things she was trying to understand completely, the gray eyes steady and wide open. She said, "I love you too. I want you to know that's mine to say. Nobody bought it. Nobody earned it. It's mine and I'm giving it to you because I want to." I put my hand over hers on my chest. The same thing I'd done in the barn in February, hand over hers, but different, because this was not the cold of a blizzard and this was not exhaustion, and there was nothing accidental about it. I held her hand there against my heart and I looked at her. I said, "I know it's yours. That's why it means what it does." She stepped in close, put her head against my shoulder. I put my arms around her and we stood like that in the kitchen while Tom was conspicuously making noise in the other room, and the flour was still on her hand, and the spring light came through the window, and the whole of the south yard was green and opening up. We married in June. Prentice performed it at the courthouse, with Tom and Gus and Webb standing around looking uncomfortable in their good shirts. Nora had a dress she'd made herself, blue, the color of good sky in the afternoon. She held my arm in the courthouse yard afterward and looked at me like she'd been looking at me since October, straight, clear, decided. Cal Briggs came to the small supper we had at the ranch, a few others. It was not a large occasion, which was how we both preferred it. There's a thing that gets said about men who come to something late in life. Some people mean it to be consoling, and some people mean it as a kind of diminishment, as if getting to a good thing after 50 is getting there too late to be worth much. I have no patience for that notion. I was 54 when I raised my hand in Monroe's yard. I was 54, and I'd built this ranch alone and buried my wife and my son, and kept going through years of solitary work and a life that ran exactly the way I said it, and not an inch beyond. 54, and something in me knew the difference between a good bid and a bad one. That first summer of being married, we rode the fence line together most mornings, she on the gray she'd picked out in the spring, and me on the sorrel I'd had for 7 years, and we talked while we rode the way we talked at the table, practical things and other things and sometimes nothing at all, just the sound of horses and the early day around us. She was learning to read the land the way I read it, and I found myself watching her do it with a particular pleasure that I couldn't entirely account for. She'd stop and look at something, a patch of grass, a change in the soil color, the way the water moved over a rock in the creek, and she'd ask me about it or she'd tell me what she thought it meant. And half the time she was right, and sometimes she saw things I'd walked past for 20 years without noticing. In August, she told me she thought she might be carrying a child. She told me in the morning at the table with the coffee between us. Said it plain, the way she said most things. Said she wasn't certain yet, but she thought so. She looked at me while she said it with that steady watching quality, reading my face. I sat with it for a moment, felt it move through me. Something that had been closed for a long time and had been opening since October and was now open all the way. I said, "Are you all right?" She said, "Yes." I said, "How do you feel about it?" She said, she stopped, said, "I feel like something I'd given up on is happening, which is terrifying and good in exactly equal measure." I said, "I know that feeling." She said, "I know you do. That's one of the reasons I told you first." I reached across the table and took her hand. She held mine back, and we sat there in the morning with the coffee and the window and the light coming up outside. There is a thing I want to say about the year that followed and the years after that, though I'm not sure I have the language for it exactly. I had built this ranch from nothing, 23 years of it. Every fence post, every head of cattle, every acre of pasture. I knew the cost of all of it in the particular currency of time and hard weather and solitary labor. I'd always been proud of it in a quiet way, the way you're proud of something you built with your own hands and without help, and while the world was not particularly paying attention or particularly caring whether you managed it. But something about the way Nora saw this place changed how I saw it. Not what it was worth. She saw it completely, was the thing. She saw the work in it, in the fences, in the soil, in the animals, in the way the building sat relative to the wind and the sun. She saw what I'd understood about this land and what I'd done with that understanding, and she said so, plainly, not in long speeches but in the particular way she had of naming a thing when she saw it. One evening in the fall she was standing at the fence gate looking north at the range going amber in the evening light, and I came up beside her and she said, without looking at me, "You did something good here. This whole place. You should know that." Just that, you should know that. I'd been here 23 years. No one had said that to me in 23 years. Not because they hadn't noticed, maybe Cal had said something like it, at the wedding, but because the kind of life I'd led was the kind where there isn't always someone standing beside you when the light is right to say the plain thing. I said, "I'm glad you're in it." She looked over at me. She put her hand through my arm the way she did in the courthouse yard, the way she'd been doing for months now, easy and certain, like a woman who knows her right to stand where she's standing. She said, "So am I." The boy was born in March. We called him Thomas for Tom Felder, who declared himself honored and then spent the better part of 3 days pretending he wasn't moved by it. Dark hair like his mother. My jaw, Nora said, which I considered debatable. Lungs that worked, which was the only thing I cared about. I held him the first time and felt, I don't have words for it that don't sound like a different kind of story than I'm telling, but I felt like a man who has been given back something he'd stopped believing was possible to be given back. I'm not saying the boy was Daniel. He wasn't Daniel. He was himself, Thomas, a new thing. But he was a child of mine alive in the world, which I'd thought was done for me, and there is no adequate way to describe standing with that in your arms for the first time at 55 years old. Nora watched me hold him. She was tired and there's a quality in a woman in those first hours, a particular kind of arrival, like a person who has just come a very long way and reached where they were going, and she watched me from the bed, and I could see in her face that she was glad to see what she was seeing. She said, "You look like you know what you're doing." I said, "I've handled younger horses." She said, "Harlan." I said, "I'm joking." She said, "I know, I love you." I said, "I love you." Tom was outside the door. He'd been outside the door for 3 hours and he'd brought coffee at some point and left it without knocking, and he was the most restrained he'd been in 9 years. When I came out and told him, he took off his hat and held it and looked at me and said, "Good." And then he put his hat back on and went to make breakfast. This is the last thing I'll say, and I'll say it plain. I am 61 years old now. The ranch is what it was and more. Nora runs the account books entirely and has added 2 new sections to the South herd and has opinions about the property that I've learned to listen to carefully because she is usually right. Thomas is 6 and spends most of his time with Gus, who has discovered that he is an excellent grandfather, which surprised no one less than Gus himself. I did not plan any of this, not one piece of it. I drove into Harlow Creek for fencing wire and a sack of oats, and I heard a crowd behind the stockbin and I stopped, and what happened after that was not a plan. It was a choice. One particular choice in a stockyard on a Tuesday, and then 100 smaller choices that followed it. But I want to say something about what that choice was. It was not charity. I knew that when I made it, and I know it now. I was not a man looking to save somebody. I was not a man looking for anything, particularly. I had been not looking for 8 years, and I was fairly good at it by then. What I did in that yard was something that came from a different place, something I couldn't have talked you through if you'd asked me to explain it. Something that said, I have hands and I have land and I have $135, and I will be damned if I stand here and watch this. That's what it was, nothing more, nothing that earned anything. And yet, the woman who stood in that yard with her arms folded and her eyes on the ground and the old bruise fading on her face, that woman came to my ranch and learned my land and fixed my accounts and sat beside me in a horse barn in February and told me she loved me in her own kitchen because she wanted to and not for any other reason on earth. She chose this, eyes open, knowing exactly what it was. That's what a man carries, not the money spent, not the account book set right or the trip to Coldwater or any of the particular pieces of it. He carries the fact of being seen clearly by a person who had every reason to see clearly and still found something worth staying for. I'm 61. I've been a rancher for 30 years and a widower for 8 and a husband again for 6 and a father for 6 more. I have more cattle than I can easily manage and a woman who keeps better books than I ever did and a boy who has his mother's eyes and a cook who has strong opinions about biscuits and a hired man who is also an accidental grandfather. Some mornings I come out before light and the frost is on the posts and the horses are moving in the near pasture and the house behind me has people in it who know my name and I stand on the porch for a minute before I go to work and I think about the Tuesday in September when I raised my hand. And I think, yes, that was the right bid. That was the right bid.